She was just a little girl with crayons and paper, yet every day she drew the same house. At first, her parents thought it was harmless, a child's imagination. But when the drawings never changed, always the same roofline, the same barred windows, their concern grew. No one in their neighborhood had ever seen this house. Then police recognized it immediately, and what they uncovered inside would shake an entire community. Why did she know this place? And how could her sketches reveal secrets buried for decades? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. It began in the most ordinary way, with a stack of copy paper and a box of crayons scattered across the kitchen table. The late afternoon light filtered through the curtains, catching dust motes as they floated between the bright wax sticks and a glass of milk resting near her elbow. She was 7 years old, with hair that never quite stayed in the braid her mother tied each morning, and she loved to draw in silence, her tongue caught between her teeth as she focused. At first, her parents didn't think much of it. Children drew the same things again and again. A sun in the corner, a stick-figure family, maybe a house with smoke curling from a chimney. But as the days stretched into weeks, the papers began to pile up, and something about the sameness unsettled them. Each drawing showed a house. Not their house, not her grandparents' cottage, not anything they recognized. The shape was distinct. 2 stories, steep roofline, windows that looked older than anything in their quiet suburban street. Always the same pointed gable with a narrow window at the center. Always the same row of 4 panes at the bottom. And always a door with 3 small squares drawn carefully above it. She pressed harder on those parts, her little hand moving with unusual precision for her age, the crayon lines darker there, as if she was determined not to forget any detail. Her mother noticed first. She had come in from folding laundry and found the girl at the table surrounded by crumpled sheets. Each discarded drawing had the same shape scratched across it, abandoned because a line was crooked or proportions felt wrong to her young eye. She wasn't satisfied until the windows were straight, the roof sharp, the door exactly the same size as in the ones before. When asked why she didn't draw anything else, she only shrugged and mumbled that she liked this one better. By the end of that week, the refrigerator door was covered with nearly identical houses. Neighbors who dropped by complimented her creativity, but pause often followed when they realized every sheet was the same. Her father peeled one from the fridge one evening, smoothing the paper in his hands as he frowned at the repeated roof and chimneys. He asked her if she had seen this house somewhere. She shook her head, still coloring in another copy, adding shading to the shutters this time. When pressed, she simply said, "It's just how it looks." Her notebooks told the same story. Between pages of spelling exercises and math problems, sketches of the house appeared in margins and on the backs of worksheets. The teacher sent a polite note home, mentioning that she seemed unwilling to draw anything else during art time. Other children painted animals, fields of flowers, or the ocean. She drew the same dark-roofed house, always with a narrow upper window that seemed more like an eye than a pane of glass. Her crayons wore down unevenly. Black and brown shrank to stubs while brighter colors, the reds and yellows most children use in cheerful drawings, remained untouched. She insisted on the muted tones, filling the paper with heavy outlines and shaded corners. Sometimes she would add faint marks around the lower edges, suggesting vines or perhaps bars. Her parents weren't sure which. In the evenings, her father gathered the pages into a stack and placed them on the counter. The pile grew until it needed a rubber band to keep it from spreading out. He joked that they could wallpaper a room with her favorite house. But beneath the humor was unease he couldn't quite name. Children were meant to invent, to experiment, to draw castles one day and spaceships the next. Fixation on a single, unchanging image seemed unusual, almost deliberate, as though she was copying from something only she could see. One night, her mother asked her again where the idea came from. Was it a dream? A picture in a book? A place she had visited? The girl thought about it. Her crayon paused above the paper, then simply answered, "It's just there." She tapped the side of her head and bent back to her work. The reply lingered in her mother's mind long after the house lights were off. Soon, the house followed them everywhere. She sketched in the car during long drives, Her small hands braced against the movement of the road. She carried folded sheets into the grocery store, showing the cashier without explanation. When her classmates drew rainbows and pets, she filled her page with the same shadowed outline. By then, her parents had memorized the details as well as she had. The too-tall roof, the square windows, the door with its 3 squares above it like a code. It was not until the 20th drawing appeared, laid carefully on her father's pillow one night, that they began to look at each other with the same unspoken question. Why this house? And why again and again? For the first time, they noticed that her sketches were not changing but becoming sharper, clearer, as though she wasn't imagining it all but remembering. The drawings had begun to overrun the house. What started as a handful taped to the refrigerator now spread into stacks on the counter, folded sheets in her backpack, loose pages tucked beneath sofa cushions, and wedged between the pages of storybooks. No matter how many times her parents asked her to draw something different, she returned again and again to the same shape. The tall roof, the narrow upper window, the 4 panes below. Subtle variations crept in, but they were not playful experiments the way children usually scribbled. They were precise, almost studied adjustments, as if she were correcting mistakes made in earlier versions. At dinner, the subject began to dominate the conversation. Her mother, setting down plates of pasta, tried to ask gently why she didn't draw their own house, with its wide porch and flower boxes. The girl only shrugged, twirling her fork while insisting that she liked the other one better. Her father suggested drawing people, maybe their family standing outside, or her friends from school. She frowned at the idea and said people didn't belong in the picture. When pressed, she simply repeated the phrase she had been using for weeks. That's just how it looks. The tone at the table shifted over time. At first they laughed about it, treating the habit as an odd quirk. Children fixated on things all the time. But as the weeks went on, the lightness faded. Her brother complained that he was tired of seeing the same house lying on the kitchen table every morning, the same roofline staring back at him from the fridge when he grabbed milk. He asked if she was trying to scare them, and her silence in response was more unsettling than any denial could have been. Her mother tried throwing away some of the papers when she thought no one would notice, slipping them into the recycling bin beneath the sink. But the girl always noticed. She would appear in the kitchen minutes later, eyes scanning the counter, and ask in a quiet, certain voice, "Where are the others?" The missing sheets were rescued and placed back in her room, as though she was guarding a growing archive no one else could understand. At school, her teacher began to take note as well. During art time, while other children painted animals, playgrounds, or cartoon characters, she would pull out her black and brown crayons and sketch the same structure with the same deliberate care. The teacher encouraged her to try drawing flowers or rainbows, but the girl refused. On one occasion, she drew the house and at the last minute added a crooked shape above it that looked like a symbol more than a cloud. When asked what it was, she only said, "It belongs there." The symbols became a quiet point of concern. At home, her parents began noticing tiny marks tucked into corners of the pages, shapes that looked like triangles, circles intersected by lines, or patterns of 3 scratches close together. They asked her why she added them. She would tap her crayon on the paper and murmur that the house needed them. When her father tried to erase one with the edge of an eraser, she snatched the drawing back, horrified, and redrew the symbol darker than before. Conversations between her parents shifted when she was out of earshot. In the living room late at night, with the television off and dishes stacked in the sink, they wondered aloud whether something was wrong. Was she remembering a place she had seen and couldn't let go of? Was it a sign of anxiety? Her mother worried it might mean more, that maybe she had seen something she wasn't supposed to. Her father countered that she was just a child with an overactive imagination, but even as he said it, he sounded unconvinced. The unease grew heavier when other adults started noticing. A classmate's parent mentioned at pickup that their daughter had said she only ever drew one house in art class. The teacher, in her next meeting with the family, cautiously suggested that the fixation was unusual. She spoke gently, choosing her words carefully, but made it clear she thought they might want to explore it further. The parents nodded, uneasy at the thought of explaining that their daughter was filling their home with stacks of the same strange, lonely house each version more exact than the last. By then, the girl's room was lined with them, papers taped to the walls, slipped under books, even arranged along the floor in overlapping layers. When asked why she needed so many, she replied simply that each one was different, even when her parents could not see how. She pointed to a line in the roof or the shading around a window and insisted the changes mattered. Her parents exchanged looks but said nothing. What unsettled them most was not the repetition itself, but the certainty in her voice whenever she explained the details. She was not inventing, not pretending. She was remembering. And though they would not admit aloud, both parents had the same thought. She was drawing a house that existed, and she was drawing it for a reason. The question of recognition began quietly, with her mother standing at the window one afternoon, watching the neat row of houses across the street. She held one of the drawings in her hand, glancing between the page and the tidy suburban homes with their trimmed hedges and identical vinyl siding. The sketch showed steep angles, tall, narrow windows, and a door that looked as though it belonged to another century. Nothing in their neighborhood resembled it, not even distantly. She tried to convince herself that it was simply imagination, the kind of Gothic house children absorb from storybooks or cartoons. Yet the girl never read such books, and she did not watch shows filled with haunted mansions or Victorian relics. Her influences were simple: picture books, cartoons about animals, school assignments. There was no reason for her to conjure this particular shape with such consistency. That evening, her father took one of the drawings out onto the porch, holding up as dusk settled over the neighborhood. He scanned the rows of homes, each one a variation of the same design, built within the last 20 years. There were no gables with sharp peaks, no tall windows divided into narrow panes, no brick chimneys leaning awkwardly against slanted roofs. The sketch was out of place, a fragment from another era slipped into their modern cul-de-sac. He folded the paper slowly and slipped it into his jacket pocket, a gesture that felt more serious than he meant it to be. Soon, the comparison spread beyond their street. On a Saturday drive through town, her mother turned the drawings over in her lap, watching for any glimpse of similarity in the houses they passed. The grocery store parking lot, the post office, the library, none of it bore resemblance to the child's obsession. The houses in their town were modest colonials, ranch style, a few Cape Cods scattered among them. All had been painted and repainted, updated with vinyl windows, modern porches, or garages. None held the character of the drawing, and yet the girl insisted it was real. One afternoon, while she sat cross-legged on the living room carpet, crayons scattered around her, she told her mother that the windows had to be narrow because they always were. When asked what she meant, she only repeated the phrase with quiet insistence. She never said she had seen the house herself. She never claimed to have visited. But her certainty was not the kind of flighty invention of children. It was the stubbornness of someone reporting facts. The details became sharper with time. Small ridges appeared along the roofline, shaded carefully as though they were ornate trim. The door gain panels, the kind carved deep into heavy wood, not the flat white surface of modern suburban doors. Sometimes she drew bricks along the side, not red or brown, but dark gray, outlined in deliberate strokes. On one drawing, she placed a round window in the attic gable, divided into 4 slices like an old clock face. Her father studied that one for a long time, remembering that he had seen similar windows only on photographs of Victorian-era houses, the sort preserved in historical districts or crumbling along forgotten roadsides. Suspicion crept in, unspoken at first. The parents found themselves wondering where such an image could come from. They had not taken her to museums with architectural displays. They had not shown her old houses. No one in the family lived in anything older than the 1950s. Still, she seemed to know features that belonged to a time before she was born, before even her parents were born. At dinner, the conversation shifted uneasily toward the question of influence. Her brother suggested she might have seen it online, but she had no computer access beyond supervised schoolwork. Her mother asked if a teacher might have shown pictures, but nothing of the sort had come home in assignments. It left them with nothing but unease, a feeling that their daughter was carrying knowledge she should not possess. Teachers began to notice the same thing. One afternoon, the art teacher pinned her drawings alongside the other children's on the classroom wall. Parents came for pickup and noticed the difference immediately. While most children had filled their pages with bright shapes and playful lines, hers stood alone, a dark, looming house with details beyond her years. One mother remarked that it looked like something out of an old town, maybe the kind you see in faded photographs. The teacher agreed quietly, her eyes on the girl, who sat at her desk doodling yet another version. By then, the parents had stopped laughing it off. The growing precision, the odd historical accuracy, could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. In hushed tones, they began to use the word strange. Strange that she never tired of it. Strange that it looked older than anything in her world. Strange that she refused to say where it came from. The house on paper had become a presence in their home, one they could not match to their own surroundings, one that seemed to belong somewhere else entirely. And yet their daughter carried it with her as though it were as real and permanent as their own address. The stack began quietly on the corner of her desk. At first, just a few pages gathered absent-mindedly when she cleaned up after art time. She had intended only to save them until the end of the day. But when she held them together and looked at them as a set, she noticed something that stopped her hand. Each page bore the same house, the same slanted roofline, the same narrow windows drawn with care far beyond the typical wobbly lines of 7-year-olds, the same shaded door with 3 small panels that never seemed to change. Children, in her years of teaching, often repeated themselves. They would draw endless cats or rainbows, superheroes or favorite toys. But none ever returned with this kind of discipline to the exact same image, not once or twice, but dozens of times. She began setting aside more. When the other children brought up their drawings proudly to pin on the wall, sunflowers, pets, stick figure families, this child would place hers silently in the teacher's hand and walk back to her seat without explanation. The teacher kept them, at first because she did not want the girl to feel her work was being dismissed, and later because the pattern itself became impossible to ignore. By the end of the month, she had nearly 20 pages clipped together, each nearly identical, each repeating what could only be described as a place. At lunch, she showed them to a colleague, lowering her voice as she spread the pages across the staff room table. Her fellow teacher frowned, flipping through them slowly. "It's very consistent," she said at last, choosing her words with care. "Almost too consistent. Most children this age can't replicate details this precisely." The conversation drifted into silence after that, both aware of how unusual it was, but neither eager to jump to conclusions. In the quiet of her classroom later that week, the teacher caught herself studying the drawings more closely than she intended. She noted how the girl pressed harder on certain features, the lines thicker and darker around the windows and the attic gable. She had added shading to suggest depth, small flourishes that hinted at architectural detail. The teacher, who had no particular background in architecture, nonetheless recognized that these were features that belonged to a style no longer common in their town. The house looked older, heavier, as though lifted from another century and set down on the page by a child's hand. She began to wonder if it was memory. Perhaps the girl had once visited such a house, and the image had lodged itself in her mind. Children often latched onto a single experience and replayed it endlessly in their drawings. But the girl's family lived in a suburban development, the sort of neighborhood where every house resembled the next. Field trips had never taken them near anything of the sort. No one in town lived in a home even remotely similar. The teacher searched her own memory for a building that resembled it and came up empty. The possibility of trauma crept into her mind next, unbidden but impossible to dismiss. Children sometimes revealed what they could not speak aloud through art. She had learned to look for the silent signs, dark colors, repeated symbols, figures without faces. Here, though, there were no people. Only the house. Always the house. It stood alone on every page, isolated, never surrounded by trees or cars or streets. Just the structure itself, as though it existed in a vacuum. That isolation troubled her more than anything. She debated bringing the matter to the school counselor. It would not take much. Just a passing mention in the weekly staff meeting, a suggestion that the drawings were unusual enough to warrant closer attention. But she hesitated. To single out a child for something she could not yet explain felt premature, even unfair. Perhaps the girl was simply gifted. her mind drawn to detail and repetition the way some children became fascinated by numbers or letters. The line between giftedness and concern was thin, and she feared misstepping. Still, the folder of drawings remained on her desk, a quiet weight she could not ignore. Some nights, when the classroom was empty and the hallways dark, she would flip through them again, feeling an unease she could not quite name. There was something about the house itself, about the way it looked out from the page, as if it were waiting to be recognized. She caught herself glancing out the window on her drive home, scanning the streets for any trace of it, though she never saw anything close. The dilemma gnawed at her. She was responsible not just for grades and lessons, but for the well-being of the children in her care. If the drawings meant something more, if they were signals of memory too heavy for words, or a secret not yet told, then she had an obligation to act. Yet if it was nothing more than imagination, she risked drawing attention to a child who wanted nothing more than to draw in peace. The next time the girl handed in another page, the teacher paused, holding it a little longer than usual. "Why this house?" she asked gently. The child looked at her, expression calm and untroubled, and answered in the same even tone she always used. "Because it's there." Then she walked back to her seat, leaving the teacher staring at the page, her dilemma unresolved, but heavier now than before. The remark came on an ordinary evening, one of those casual visits that never seemed to carry weight until afterward. The girl's aunt had stopped by after work, her arms filled with groceries she thought might help her sister's family stretch through the week. They sat together at the kitchen table while the girl wandered in and out, humming quietly to herself, leaving a trail of crayons and folded sheets of paper in her wake. It was not unusual. Everyone in the family knew she loved to draw, but no one expected the pause that followed when her aunt's eyes settled on the refrigerator door. Pinned beneath a mismatched magnet was yet another drawing of the house. The same steep roof, the same tall windows that pressed together like narrow watchful eyes, the same door with its 3 small squares. Her aunt leaned closer, tilting her head slightly, as though trying to line up the picture in her mind with something half-remembered. "You know," she said slowly, "this looks just like one of those houses on the other side of town, up near the old mill road. I can't quite place which one, but it feels familiar." The words hung there longer than anyone expected. Her mother turned from the sink, drying her hands on a dish towel, and asked what she meant. The aunt shrugged, suddenly uncertain, her gaze still fixed on the drawing. "I don't know exactly," she admitted. "It's just the shape, the roof line, maybe. There are some old places out that way, falling apart, most of them. I used to drive past when I worked at the fabric shop years ago." Her father, who had been leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee, frowned at the thought. He had grown tired of the drawings, tired of the way they seemed to seep into every corner of their home. But hearing that the house might correspond to something real shifted the mood in an unsettling way. "You think she's copying something she saw?" he asked. His sister-in-law shook her head. "She wouldn't have been out there, would she? Those houses are all but abandoned now. No reason for a child to know them." The girl, who had been crouched on the floor arranging crayons into careful lines, looked up briefly at the conversation, her expression unreadable. She did not comment, did not ask questions, only bent back to her arrangement as if the subject did not concern her. That silence pressed heavier than words. Later that evening, after the aunt had left, her mother stood for a long time in front of the fridge. The drawing seemed different now. Before, it had been unsettling in its precision, in its persistence, but it had lived in the space of imagination, something conjured by a child's hand, no matter how strange. Now, with a suggestion that it resembled a real structure, the paper carried new weight. It was no longer only repetition. It was recognition. She tried to picture the houses her sister had mentioned, but memory failed. The mill road was a part of town they rarely drove through, a place spoken of more often than seen. The remnants of an older community lingered there. Shops long closed, wooden porches that sagged under their own weight, windows covered with boards and ivy. If the child's drawing matched something from that road, it would not have been from her own experience. She had never been taken there, never shown photographs. The realization made her mother's stomach tighten. At bedtime, when she tucked her daughter beneath the blankets, she tried to ask gently, Your aunt said she's seen a house like this. Do you remember being there? The girl shook her head. No, she said simply, eyes already drooping. I just know it. The answer was quiet, certain, and offered no more. Her father and mother spoke in low voices long after the children were asleep. He suggested it was coincidence, that many old houses look the same after a while. Roofs and windows could blur together in memory. But she disagreed. The details were too specific. The attic window, the heavy door panels, the way her daughter never wavered on those features. Coincidence did not explain the persistence, nor the symbols tucked into the margins. The aunt's remark echoed in their mind for days. At the grocery store, her mother found herself scanning the faces of neighbors, half expecting someone else to mention it. When she picked her daughter up from school, she looked more closely at the route home, at the corners of town they normally overlooked. Every porch, every set of windows seemed to carry new weight, as if any of them might suddenly align with the pages filling their home. But nothing matched. Nothing near them bore the marks of that drawn place. And yet the possibility had been planted. Somewhere not far away, the house could be standing in silence, weathered and waiting, its image carried faithfully in the hand of a child who had never seen it. The thought unsettled them most of all. Not the drawings themselves, but the quiet suggestion that their daughter was not inventing at all. She was remembering, and what she remembered might still exist. The decision to take the drawings beyond the walls of their home did not come lightly. For weeks the parents had argued quietly about what, if anything, should be done. Her mother believed that the persistence, the uncanny detail, hinted at something more than childish fixation. Her father resisted, insisting it was nothing more than a phase, something that would fade in time like an old toy or a forgotten favorite show. But the aunt's offhand comment lingered in their minds, a reminder that the sketches resembled something real, a place rooted in the geography of their town. It was her mother who finally gathered a small stack of the drawings, smoothed them flat on the kitchen counter, and placed them carefully into a large envelope. She did not announce her plan, but carried them in silence to the police station one cool morning, with her husband following reluctantly at her side. The station was quiet, its front desk manned by an officer who looked more accustomed to handling parking complaints and noise disputes than the mystery of a child's artwork. He greeted them with polite curiosity, motioning them to sit while they explained. Her mother slid the envelope across the counter, her voice steady but edged with unease. "Our daughter has been drawing this same house for months," she said. "We don't recognize it. She's never been there, but she won't stop." The officer opened the envelope and spread the papers out in front of him. He studied them with a faint smile adults often wear when indulging anxious parents. "Kids draw what they see," he said. "Maybe she saw it in a storybook, maybe on television." Her father nodded as though to affirm the point, but her mother pressed on. "She hasn't. We've checked. And the details, look at them, they're always the same. She doesn't change anything." The officer leaned back in his chair, flipping through the stack without urgency. The roof lines, the narrow windows, the shaded door appeared again and again. He murmured something about imagination, about how children fixate, how sometimes they need reassurance more than investigation. He was about to close the folder when his eyes caught on one particular page. He paused, tilting his head slightly, then leaned closer. "That's unusual," he muttered, pointing at the bottom edge of the house. The parents leaned in as well, following his finger. Beneath the line of the first floor, the girl had drawn small rectangles, uneven but deliberate, shaded dark. At first glance, they seemed like decorative bricks, but the officer saw something else. "Those look like windows," he said quietly, "but they're too low. They'd be at the level of a basement." Her mother felt a chill move across her shoulders. She had seen those shapes dozens of times and had never thought beyond the scribbles. "Basement windows?" she asked. The officer nodded, his expression narrowing as his tone shifted from casual to serious. "Yes, and here," he tapped the dark lines drawn across them. "Bars." She drew them as barred windows. The room grew silent. The parents exchanged glances, their unease deepening into something closer to fear. The officer looked back at the drawing, tracing the lines again with his eyes. "I've seen houses like this," he said slowly. "Old properties from the late 19th century. Some had cellars with windows at ground level, covered with iron grates. But it's not something a child today would be likely to know. Her father cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. So what are you saying? That she's seen a place like this before? The officer folded the papers neatly, his earlier dismissive smile gone. I can't say that, but it's odd. If she's never been near one of those old houses, it would be hard for her to invent this detail. He slid the drawings back into the envelope, pressing his palm flat on the stack. Do you mind if I keep a copy of a few of these? I'd like to check something. Her mother agreed immediately, though her husband hesitated. The officer excused himself and stepped into a back room, leaving them waiting in the quiet lobby. They could hear the low murmur of his voice as he made a phone call, though the words did not carry clearly. When he returned, his face betrayed little, but his manner was different. He thanked them for bringing the drawings in, told them he would pass them along to someone who might know more about local properties, and advised them to keep an eye on their daughter's behavior. As they left the station, the father tried to downplay it, telling his wife that the officer was only being cautious, that nothing would come of it. But her mother carried the weight of his pause, the way his voice had shifted when he saw the barred windows. It was not the reaction of someone humoring an overactive imagination. It was a reaction of recognition, of something that had unsettled him in its familiarity. At home that night, the girl drew again at the kitchen table, her crayons moving in the same deliberate lines. Her mother watched quietly, no longer seeing simple repetition, but a message they had not yet learned to read. The barred windows stared back at her from the page, silent but insistent, as though they were waiting for someone to understand what they meant. The drawings did not disappear once the parents handed them over. A copy remained in a folder at the police station, where a detective took them home one evening, setting the envelope on his kitchen table while the rest of his household slept. He had been in the force long enough to recognize the difference between a family wasting time with fears about imagination and a case where something deeper lurked beneath the surface. He unfolded the papers carefully, spreading them out across the table in sequence. The repetition unsettled him. Each house was nearly identical, its roof pitched at the same steep angle, its narrow windows drawn with care, the barred cellar panes shaded dark. This was not whimsy. It was memory or knowledge. The next morning, he carried the folder into the records room at the station, a cramped space filled with filing cabinets and yellowing maps pinned to the walls. He began pulling property surveys, starting with the older sections of town. Many of the newer homes bore no resemblance to the girl's sketches. Suburban developments of the last 40 years favored open porches, sliding windows, and attached garages. Her drawings showed none of these things. They belonged to another era. He moved gradually back through time, examining parcels from the early 20th century, then the late 19th. That was where the details began to align. The old industrial neighborhoods, built when the mills still ran along the river, held houses with cellars that broke through at ground level. Several had narrow windows meant for ventilation, many covered with iron bars to keep vagrants from crawling in. The detective traced his finger along the plats and property outlines, feeling a faint chill as the shape of certain lots seemed to echo the girl's pictures. He pulled deeds from the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s, cross-referencing addresses that had since fallen into disuse. Some were condemned, some demolished, others left standing on overgrown plots behind chain-link fences. Piece by piece, the pattern sharpened. The house she drew was not a random invention. It was almost certainly one of these old residences, preserved in memory long after it had slipped from the consciousness of the town. By the end of the week, a small group of officers gathered in the records room after hours, leaning over the spread of maps and photocopies. They whispered among themselves, not yet ready to admit openly that they were chasing the line of a child's crayon. But none could ignore the precision of the drawings. "Look here," one said, pointing to an address on the north side of town, near the old mill road. 2 stories, built in 1891, recorded with a gabled attic and barred cellar windows. "It fits." Another detective nodded, flipping back to the sketch where the little girl had pressed hard on the crayon to shade the narrow rectangles at the foundation. "She shouldn't know that," he said quietly. "No one her age should even think of adding that detail." The investigation widened. They pulled inspection reports, police logs, and property tax records. The house in question had been cited multiple times for disrepair, its owners long gone, its structure teetering on the edge of collapse. Neighbors had lodged complaints in the past, though the property had fallen silent for years. When photographs turned up in an old file, grainy black and white prints taken for code enforcement, the detectives laid them side by side with the girl's drawings. The resemblance was undeniable. The steep roof, the pointed attic gable, the heavy front door with its panels carved in squares. Even the alignment of the cellar windows matched. Whispers spread through the station. Some scoffed quietly, saying it was chance that children picked up fragments of architecture without knowing it. But others remembered the rumors that had clung to that neighborhood, the stories of disappearances and unexplained noises that neighbors had passed down like folklore. The house had been watched before, investigated lightly, and then abandoned again when no evidence was found. Now it was being brought forward by the hand of a child who had never set foot on that road. The detective in charge pressed his palms flat on the table, staring at the photographs. "We can't ignore this," he said. "She's not drawing fantasy. She's drawing a place that exists. And if she's right about the barred cellar windows, there may be more here than just an abandoned house." His words carried the weight of reluctant recognition. From that point forward, the search took on quiet urgency. Files were copied, maps were marked, and a discreet watch was ordered on the property, without any public announcement. They did not want gossip to spread, did not want to ignite panic over a case that was still half-formed. But in the private corners of the station, there was little doubt left. The house was not random. It was not imagined. It corresponded, piece by piece, to a documented residence whose silence had gone unquestioned for too long. And now, for reasons no one could explain, a child had pulled it back into the light. The sketches had circulated quietly through the station for weeks, passed from desk to desk, shown in hushed tones rather than filed in any official case folder. Most regarded them with curiosity, some with doubt, but none could dismiss them entirely. It was during one of those late afternoons, when the office was nearly empty and the hum of the overhead lights was the only sound, that a retired officer stopped by for a visit. He was well past his years of service, hair gone white, his gait slowed but steady, a man who carried the weight of memories long buried under the routines of younger men now wearing the badge. He had come only to share coffee with an old colleague, but as he sat waiting in the front room, his eyes caught on the stack of papers spread across the corner of a desk. With the casual curiosity of someone passing time, he pulled the drawings closer. He did not expect them to grip him. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through each page, the repeated roof lines, the narrow windows, the barred cellar panes staring back at him again and again. He leaned closer, his breath slowing, as recognition pressing like a shadow he thought he had left behind decades earlier. When the detective returned, the old man did not look up at first. His finger rested on one of the pages, tracing the outline of the attic gable. At last he spoke, his voice low and weighted with certainty. "I know this place," he said. The detective frowned, unsure whether to dismiss the remark as nostalgia. But the retired officer did not waver. He looked up, his eyes clear despite his age. "I know it," he repeated. "We worked a case there years ago, a case we never solved." The room grew quiet. The other detectives who lingered nearby shifted closer, drawn by the change in tone. The retired officer explained slowly, each word carrying the weight of memory. In the late 70s, he had been assigned to a missing persons investigation. A woman had disappeared, last seen walking near the industrial side of town. The search had turned up little, but whispers had led them to a particular house on the far edge of the mill road. They had gone inside once, long ago, finding nothing but dust and neglect. No evidence, no body, no crime they could prove. But he remembered the house. He remembered the barred windows at the cellar, the strange silence that clung to its walls, the way the neighbors avoided speaking of it. And now, decades later, a child's hand had drawn it in detail too exact to ignore. The detectives exchanged uneasy glances. They had suspected the drawings pointed to something real, but until now they lacked confirmation. The retired officer's recognition shifted everything. It was no longer a theory, no longer speculation. This was a house with a history, tethered to a cold case that had never found resolution. He insisted they drive out immediately. "Don't wait for paperwork," he said firmly, his voice stronger than his years suggested. "Don't waste time with reports. That place has been waiting too long." His urgency startled them. They were accustomed to measured steps, to procedure, to forms filed in triplicate before any movement was made. But there was something in his tone, an authority born not of rank but of lived experience, that pressed him into motion. By the time the sun dipped low against the horizon, a small caravan of unmarked cars was moving through the back roads toward the outskirts of town. The retired officer rode along in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the passing fields as though watching for ghosts. He gave quiet directions, turning them away from the main streets, down narrower lanes where houses thinned out and the land grew wild. The roads felt older here, lined with sagging fences and weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. The town's hum of modern life faded behind them. At last he pointed. "There," he said. The car slowed. Through the windshield, half concealed by trees and shadows, stood the shape they had seen again and again on the child's pages. Even from the road, the resemblance was undeniable. The steep roofline rose above the overgrown yard. The attic gable stared back like a watchful eye, and low to the ground, where the foundation met the earth, were the narrow windows covered in rusting bars. The detective sat in silence, each absorbing the weight of the sight. The retired officer exhaled slowly, his shoulders heavy. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the house." No one spoke for several moments. The engine idled, headlights casting a pale glow across the sagging porch. What had once been speculation, lines on a child's paper, was now stone and wood, standing before them with the weight of years. The girl had drawn the truth, over and over, until someone finally listened. And now, with the house before them and the past pressing in, the detectives understood that they had stepped into something deeper than they had ever expected, a place where memory, imagination, and unfinished history had converged. The unmarked cars rolled to a stop at the edge of a dirt path, their headlights cutting pale arcs through the heavy overgrowth. Beyond the glare, the house stood in silence, framed by trees whose branches clawed across the roof as if trying to drag it back into the earth. Even from a distance, the resemblance to the little girl's drawings was undeniable. The steep pitch of the roof, the pointed gable jutting out like a stern eyebrow, the narrow windows shaded by years of grime. It was all there, rendered in wood and wrought exactly as her crayons had captured on paper. The detectives climbed out slowly, the crunch of gravel under their boots sounding louder than it should in the hushed woods. No one spoke at first. They stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the sagging shape of the building. The retired officer's breath came steady but shallow, as if each second of recognition pressed down on his chest. One detective lifted the folder he carried, pulling out a sketch to hold against the sight before them. There was no room for doubt. The match was exact, line for line, as though the child had been standing here herself when she first put crayon to paper. Up close, the house revealed its years of neglect. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving behind gray slats of weatherwood that curled and split like brittle paper. The porch leaned at a dangerous angle, its railings broken in sections, steps warped and slick with moss. Each window was dull with a film of dirt, though the outlines of their panes matched the girl's obsessive repetition with eerie precision. The roof sagged under the weight of time, but its triangular lines were unmistakable, a geometry etched into memory. The officers moved in a slow half-circle, their flashlights cutting through the dimness. Weeds choked the yard, pushing up against rusting fencing that sagged under its own weight. A mailbox leaned sideways, its paint faded to illegibility, though the faint trace of numbers still clung to the metal. The closer they looked, the more details surfaced that echoed the drawings. A heavy door with recessed panels, the same shaded rectangles marking the foundation, where cellar windows were barred with corroded iron. One detective crouched to run his hand along the rusting metal, the bars still cold and unyielding even after so many years. He pulled back quickly, as though touching them confirmed something he had not wanted to admit aloud. They circled toward the back, where the woods pressed tighter, trees leaning in with branches knotted like fingers. Here the house seemed almost swallowed, its rear walls stained darker, roof shingles missing in uneven patches. The air smelled of damp wood and earth, of a place cut off from life. They paused at a rear window. Its glass cracked through the middle, a jagged scar. Inside, the beam of a flashlight revealed nothing but peeling wallpaper and a floor littered with fallen plaster. Yet the silence inside seemed heavier than the emptiness suggested, as if the house held its breath, waiting. The retired officer pointed to the gable above, his voice low. "That's where I remember it most," he said. "That attic window. I could swear it watched us the last time we were here." The others followed his gaze. The window stared back, glass dark, reflecting nothing but their lights. It was precisely as the girl had drawn it, a small square with two narrow panes, marked again and again in her childish but deliberate strokes. One of the younger detectives pulled out another sketch, showing it to the group. "She drew this roof line 30 times, he said, his voice unsteady. "Every time the same. This is it. This is the place." The weight of realization settled over them all. There was no longer any question of coincidence. The house existed in the real world exactly as it existed in the child's mind. For a long while, none of them moved closer. The woods pressed in, the house loomed silent, and the resemblance of the drawing seemed almost too perfect, as though the building itself had been waiting to be found. The barred cellar windows, the leaning porch, the sharp gable and sagging roof. It was all there, replicated line by line in a way no child should ever have known. The retired officer finally broke the stillness. "Whatever's inside," he said, "she already knew it was here. We just didn't listen soon enough." The detectives looked at one another, their faces pale in the sweep of flashlight beams. The house in the woods was no longer just a drawing, no longer just a story told by a worried family. It stood before them in wood and iron, in rotten silence, daring them to step across its threshold and discover why a little girl, with crayons and paper, had carried its likeness in her hand as if it were the only thing she could remember. The days that followed the discovery of the house were filled with quiet, methodical digging through archives that most people had forgotten even existed. The detectives who had first stood in the overgrown yard now spent their hours in dim back rooms of the municipal building, poring over yellowing documents that smelled of dust and old ink. The more they searched, the more the story of the house began to take shape, not in straight lines, but in fragments, an address scrawled in the margin, a newspaper clipping faded to sepia, a police report filed and closed without resolution. Piece by piece, a disturbing history emerged. The property records placed ownership in the hands of one man for nearly 3 decades, from the late 1960s to the 1980s. His name was Arthur Bellamy, a figure who, according to the town collective memory, had lived on the edge of both the woods and of society. He had been described as quiet, almost reclusive, working odd jobs in town, but never staying long in any one place. People remembered him walking the streets late at night, shoulders hunched, his eyes flicking quickly away when met by another's. He had no wife, no children, no family anyone could recall. What he did have was a house, which seemed less a home and more a fortress of silence. Its curtains always drawn, its yard overrun even when the surrounding houses were tidy and neat. Newspaper clippings filled in the whispers. In 1981, a brief article mentioned the investigation into the disappearance of 2 young men who had last been seen entering the woods not far from the Bellamy property. Police had searched, neighbors had speculated, but the trail went cold. A year later, another clipping referenced complaints filed by nearby residents. Screams heard at night, strange lights in the windows, the sound of heavy objects being dragged across floors. Authorities responded more than once, but each time, according to reports, they found nothing unusual. The house yielded no proof, no evidence of crime. Bellamy himself, when questioned, was polite but evasive, offering explanations that satisfied just enough to avoid arrest. The detectives traced the paper trail further, uncovering an old file from the county sheriff's office. The file had been thin, more notes than documentation, but revealed that Bellamy had been a subject of interest in several cases of missing persons throughout the early 1980s. Travelers, drifters, and those on the margins of society had vanished, their last known movements placing them somewhere near the edges of town. The house in the woods had been mentioned more than once, but always as rumor, never as fact. The sheriff at the time had reportedly ordered surveillance, but nothing came of it. The file ended abruptly in 1986, when Bellamy himself disappeared. No forwarding address, no signs of departure, just gone. The house, empty and unclaimed, passed into neglect, slowly folding back into trees until it became more myth than memory. The neighbors interviewed decades later still carried unease in their voices. One woman, now in her 70s, remembered being a child and daring her friends to ride their bikes past the house at dusk. She recalled the way the windows seemed to watch, the silence that hung heavier there than anywhere else in town. Another man recounted how his dog would growl and refused to go near the path that led to the Bellamy property. Others told of seeing visitors knock on the door, strangers perhaps seeking lodging or work, who were never seen again. No one could prove these stories, but they persisted, passed down quietly like warnings that had outlived the man himself. For the detectives reviewing the material, the unease only grew. What disturbed the most was not just the history itself, but the realization that nothing had ever been resolved. There had been no conclusive evidence, no closure to the rumors that clung to the property. It was a house marked by suspicion, abandoned to time, and now resurrected in the sketches a little girl who should have had no knowledge of it at all. The retired officer, when shown the records, closed his eyes and nodded slowly. He remembered the calls, the late nights when they had been sent to the property, the sense of something just beyond reach slipping away before they could grasp it. "We knew something was wrong," he murmured, "but we could never prove it." He always stayed just inside the line of the law. And then one day he was gone. The past, it seemed, had been waiting. The child's drawings had reopened a door that had been left ajar for decades, and what lay beyond it was a history too heavy to ignore. The house was no longer just an abandoned structure in the woods. It was a site of unanswered questions, a place where screams had once echoed, where people had stepped inside and failed to return. And though the man who owned it had vanished long ago, the memory of what might have happened within those walls lingered, waiting for someone, finally, to demand the truth. The first entry into the house was not dramatic, but deliberate. Every motion measured, as if each step might awaken something better left undisturbed. The officers moved in pairs, flashlights slicing through gloom, their boots creaking against warped boards that threatened to give way. The air inside was thick, stale, heavy with the smell of mold and decay, a place sealed from life for far too long. Dust hung in the beams of light, like suspended ash, disturbed only by the movement of men who knew they were trespassing on more than just abandoned property. The front room was suffocating in its silence. What once may have been a parlor was now a skeletal version of itself, its wallpaper peeled into long curls, exposing gray plaster beneath. A rotted couch slumped against the far wall, its stuffing spilling out like entrails. A chair lay on its side, legs snapped and twisted. Every piece of furniture seemed arrested in collapse, as though the house itself had long ago given up on order. Yet it was not the ruin that unsettled detectives most, but the details. Faint carvings etched into the wooden beams that framed the walls. By flashlight they appeared as lines, symbols half worn by age but still deliberate in design. Circles intersecting with triangles, jagged spirals, marks that seemed too precise to be accidents decay. One detective raised a sketch that had been collected from the girl, holding it in the dim light. There, among the crayon lines of a roof and barred windows, were smaller details often overlooked, odd shapes drawn into corners, tiny marks repeated again and again. Comparing them now to the beams, the resemblance was inescapable. She had drawn what was inside, what no one walking past the house would have seen. They moved deeper, into a hallway that sagged beneath the weight of neglect. The floor was soft, rotting, forcing them to tread carefully. Doors led into small rooms, each more suffocating than the last. One had the remnants of a bed frame, its mattress long since disintegrated into dust and mold. Another contained only a broken dresser, drawers yanked out and left to rot. On the walls, again, the marks. Some etched shallow, some gouged deep as though cut in anger or ritual. The detectives marked them down, photographs snapping in bursts of light that briefly illuminated the symbols before surrendering to shadow again. In the kitchen, the smell of damp wood gave way to something sharper, metallic. Rusting pans still hung from hooks. A table sat crooked on 3 legs, and in the corner a pile of broken glass glittered faintly. Beneath one window, barred like the girl's sketches had shown, the paint was stained darker, a discoloration that spread across the wall like a shadow. No one spoke of what it might once have been. The cellar door hung from its hinges in the hallway, leading downward into a blackness that seemed to swallow even the strongest flashlight beams. The officers hesitated there, the retired man among them shaking his head as if remembering why he had once avoided it. When they finally descended, the air grew colder, damper, the smell of earth thick enough to choke. Down below, stone walls pressed tight, the ground uneven with dirt. Old furniture lay broken in heaps, tables, chairs, a trunk half smashed and empty. But what held their attention were the carvings, far more numerous here. Every beam that supported the ceiling had been marked, layer upon layer of scratched symbols that seemed almost alive in the shifting light. Some were small, repeated in rows. Others sprawling across the grain were like maps of things unseen. One detective pointed. His voice hushed, though no one had told him to whisper. "She drew this," he said, tracing the outline of a spiral with his gloved finger. She drew this exact thing. The spiral matched one of the repeated figures from the child's stacks of drawings, drawn in crayon with a precision uncanny for her age. Here it was gouged into a beam, deep enough to catch shadows and hold them. The deeper they went, the more the house seemed to resist. Every board creaked. Every breath stirred dust that clawed at the throat. Yet the evidence continued to mount. Symbols carved where no passerby could see. Architectural details preserved in decay that aligned perfectly with what the girl had laid out in her repetitive sketches. Even the barred windows of the cellar were real. Cold iron pressed into stone, their metal frames rusted but still firm. No child should have known them, yet she had drawn them countless times with unwavering insistence. The detective surfaced at last into the parlor, the dim light of late afternoon struggling through dirty windows. They looked at one another, their faces pale, their clothes coated in dust. The house was not simply abandoned, not just a relic of a reclusive man who had disappeared. It was something stranger, layered with memory and warning, its interior bearing silent witness to events no file had ever proven. The retired officer let out a long breath, shaking his head. "She's been inside this place," he said quietly, "or something wants us to believe she has." The others said nothing, but the thought pressed heavily on all of them. A child had sketched a hidden truth no one else had seen for decades, a truth that had waited in silence behind the house's sealed door, preserved in dust and carvings, until someone finally walked back inside. The staircase groaned as the men descended, each step releasing a muted echo into the hollow dark. Their flashlights cut across the walls, the beams scattering as though the air itself resisted being pierced. At the base of the stairs, beneath the weight of decades, stood the cellar door. Unlike the others in the house, this one was not simply warped or broken by age. It was intact, heavy, reinforced with thick iron bolts that seemed out of place in a residence that otherwise bore only the marks of neglect. The wood was scarred, scraped with long, shallow marks that did not look like the work of time. They had the uneven, desperate quality of fingernails dragged until they split. The detective stopped before it, the silence pressing so tightly that even breathing felt intrusive. No one wanted to be the first to test the door. Finally, one of them laid a hand on the iron latch, and it held firm, unmoving. They exchanged glances, not of curiosity but of quiet dread, as if already aware of what was waiting. With crowbars and force, they set upon the bolts, the metallic ring of each strike filling the cellar. Rust fell away in flakes, the bolts straining, until finally the door gave a deep, reluctant groan. The smell that escaped was stronger, earthier, carrying with it the faint metallic tang that no one dared name aloud. When the door swung open, their flashlights swept into a room that was not like the others above. This was not simply decay. This was a place constructed with purpose, and the purpose was unmistakable. The basement stretched low and narrow, the walls lined with stone rather than wood, closing in like the inside of a tomb. Chains hung from iron rings set into the wall, their ends clattering softly against the damp stone as the officers moved. They were not new, but neither were they relics of some distant century. The metal bore the wear of use, pitted with rust but still strong enough to hold. Scattered across the floor were the remains of discarded belongings, a shoe without its pair, a torn scrap of cloth that might once have been part of a shirt, Rusted cans and bottles, some shattered, others collapsed inward. A doll's head lay on its side near the corner, its glass eyes cracked, one socket empty. Each item was covered in a film of dust, yet their arrangement did not feel accidental. It was as if they had been dropped in haste, left behind in a moment, when leaving quickly mattered more than taking them along. But it was the walls that silenced even the most hardened among them. Scratched into the stone were markings, not carved with tools, but gouged as though by fingernails, metal fragments, or anything sharp enough to cut. At first they seemed random, a confusion of lines upon lines, layered so thickly that they created a chaotic tapestry. But the longer the men looked, the more patterns began to emerge. Repeated words, though many were legible, overlapped in uneven script. There were symbols too, circles intersected by jagged lines, crude figures of hands, eyes, and spirals that pressed deeper than the rest. One officer ran a hand along the stone, his glove brushing against grooves still rough, as if they had been made with urgency. He pulled back quickly, as though contact with them was something unnatural. Another held up a photograph from the girl's drawings, comparing the small spirals she had etched repeatedly in her papers to the larger, deeper spirals that covered the wall. The match was undeniable. The room was colder than the rest of the house, the kind of cold that seemed not just the absence of heat, but the presence of something else, something that had never left, even after years of abandonment. The men's flashlights reflected against the damp walls, giving the impression that the scratches shifted when one wasn't looking directly at them. Every corner of the space carried an unspoken weight, as though it remembered everything done within it and refused to let go. In the far end of the room, beneath a rotted beam, lay a trunk half collapsed under its own weight. When pried open, it revealed only fragments, rotted fabric, more scraps of paper, and a small notebook whose ink had long bled into illegibility. What faint words remained mirrored the same markings on the walls, the same shapes the child had drawn again and again. It was not evidence in the formal sense, not something that would hold in a courtroom, but it was enough to convince everyone present that the girl had seen into a place she should never have known existed. The door, once forced open, was left ajar, though every instinct told him it should have been sealed again. No one wanted to stand near it longer than necessary. The cellar, now revealed, was not just another room of the house, but a memory preserved in stone and iron, a place where the silence was louder than any scream. The detectives exchanged no words as they left it. Their footsteps hurried now, their shoulders hunched as though burdened by the knowledge that nothing in that room was imagined. Above, in the fading daylight, the girl's drawings were passed around once more. Each barred window, each spiral, each impossible detail was confirmed in stone and iron beneath the staircase. And though the house had revealed one of its secrets, it felt as though it had only opened the first door, leaving the rest weigh heavily on anyone who dared to linger. The discovery of the cellar altered the course of the investigation entirely. Until then, the drawings had been a curiosity, an unsettling coincidence perhaps, but still abstract. Now, confronted with chains embedded in stone and markings etched into the walls with unmistakable desperation, the officers could not dismiss what lay before them. They sealed off the property, stringing yellow tape around the perimeter and posting guards at the door. By the next morning, boxes of files began to arrive at the station, drawn from archives that had not been opened in decades. The task was simple but grim: to compare what they had found inside the house with a long list of names and possessions associated with the county's unresolved disappearances. The missing persons report stretched back further than anyone wanted to admit. Some were yellowed pages typed on machines that had long since been retired. Others were handwritten notes from patrolmen who had been on the force when everything was still recorded in ledgers. There were dozens of cases, each one ending with the same unresolved mark: disappeared without trace, whereabouts unknown, last seen walking home, last known to have entered a vehicle, last spotted near the edge of town. At the time, no one had been able to connect them. They were treated as isolated tragedies, misfortunes, sometimes dismissed as people running away from debts, families, or personal troubles. But as the detectives read them now, with the memory of that cellar fresh in their minds, the gaps between the cases began to close. The doll's head recovered from the basement floor was the first clue to a line. A photograph stapled to a report from 1989 showed a child missing from a neighboring county. In the picture, clutched in her arms, was the same doll, its face intact then, its hair still golden and full. Her parents had searched for years, distributing flyers, making calls that were never returned. The doll was listed in her file as the only toy she had carried with her the day she vanished. Another item, a shoe cracked with age and dust, matched the description of clothing worn by a young man who disappeared after leaving his job at a local factory in the early 1990s. The style was dated, the kind sold cheaply in department stores long since closed, but the size, the stitching, and the scuff marks were consistent with the notes taken by officers at the time. Piece by piece, the basement transformed from a silent ruin into a repository of the lost. A locket, tarnished but still clasping a photograph, was traced to a missing woman whose case had briefly attracted headlines before vanishing into silence. A strip of fabric with an unusual pattern matched the description of a jacket reported on a teenage boy who disappeared on his way home from a football game. Each discovery, when laid beside the files, carried the weight of finality. The belongings had not simply been abandoned. They had been left behind by people who never returned. The room upstairs at the station grew quiet as the evidence was cataloged. Officers who had once dismissed the girl's drawings now spoke in hushed tones, aware that they were reconstructing a truth that had been buried both by time and by deliberate neglect. For every item identified, another file was reopened, another family name resurfaced. The house was no longer just a derelict structure hidden among the trees. It was a crime scene preserved by abandonment, a place where the echoes of suffering had lain dormant until a child's hand unknowingly drew them back into view. Reporters had not yet been alerted, but word spread quickly through the department. Retired officers began to call in, some remembering fragments of earlier investigations. One mentioned hearing complaints from neighbors in the late 1980s about noises at odd hours, screams muffled by distance, lights flickering where no one should have been awake. Another recalled patrol cars driving past the property, only to be waved off with excuses about eccentric behavior. At the time, with no evidence, there had been little reason to pursue the matter. Now, in the shadow of what had been uncovered, those dismissals carried a different weight. The files painted a portrait not of accidents or wanderings, but of a pattern. The victims were varied in age and circumstance, yet all had vanished within a range of years when the reclusive owner was still alive. The authorities could no longer claim coincidence. The cellar told its own story in scratches and rust, and the reports filled in the names of those who had been silenced there. One detective, thumbing through a particularly thin file from 1983, paused at a detail almost forgotten. The woman described had last been seen carrying a spiral-bound notebook, which she never left behind. In the evidence collected from the trunk in the cellar, among the rotted fabric and blurred ink, lay the cover of a notebook too damaged to open, but still bearing the faint impression of spirals. The parallel was chilling. By nightfall, the house was no longer just a location under suspicion. It had become the locus of multiple disappearances, officially linked for the first time. Families who had lived for decades without closure now had reason to hope for answers, however grim. The girl's drawings, once regarded as an oddity, had torn open the sealed door of history, forcing into light the cases that had been allowed to fade. And as the investigators pinned photographs, belongings, and reports side by side on the board, the shape of the truth was undeniable. The little house she had drawn again and again was not simply from her imagination. It was a map of what had been hidden, and proof that the past had never been buried as deeply as people wished to believe. The more the investigation deepened, the more the girl's role shifted from curious coincidence to central mystery. Her drawings, once dismissed as childish repetitions, had led to the discovery of evidence tied to disappearances that had haunted the town for decades. Now detectives and psychologists turned their attention to her, trying to understand how a child who had never traveled beyond her small community, who had never been shown pictures of old neighborhoods or studied architecture beyond simple storybooks, could so accurately depict details hidden inside a decaying house. Her parents, anxious but cooperative, brought her to the station on a quiet afternoon, away from the crowds that had begun to gather outside. The girl sat at a small table with her crayons and lined paper, as she always did, swinging her legs gently under the chair. She seemed calm, even cheerful, unaware of the weight her drawings carried in the minds of the adults watching her. One of the detectives, a woman with a soft voice, asked if she might draw again. Without hesitation, the girl picked up a crayon and began to sketch the house. Each line was precise in the way only familiarity allows. The same sharp roof, the same slanted windows, the same cellar marked with small rectangles indicating bars. When asked how she knew to draw the house this way, the girl simply shrugged and said it was what she saw. Press further. She explained that it came to her in dreams. She described lying in bed at night and seeing the house as if she were walking around it. Sometimes she would see the roof from above, sometimes the steps leading down to the cellar door. When she woke in the morning, she felt the urge to draw it before the picture faded. The detectives traded glances. It was one thing for a child to describe a recurring dream, but another for the dream to contain architectural details that matched an actual location hidden deep in the woods, complete with features invisible to the public eye. The barred cellar windows, for example, had been obscured for years by overgrown brush and shadows. Even neighbors who had lived nearby for decades admitted they had never noticed them, and yet the girl had drawn them repeatedly in the same place, with the same spacing, as if she had seen them up close. A psychologist was brought in to speak with her, careful not to frighten or suggest answers. He asked if anyone had shown her pictures of houses like the one she drew. She shook her head. He asked if she had ever been to the other side of town where older buildings stood. Again, she said no. Each answer was given with the plain certainty of a child who did not yet understand why her knowledge was impossible. She wasn't evasive, and she showed no signs of rehearsed storytelling. To her, the explanation was simple. She dreamed it. Her parents sat nearby, visibly uneasy. They had never encouraged the drawings, never even discussed a strange house until the authorities had become involved. The father admitted he once tried to redirect her, giving her books of fairy tales to copy from, but she returned to the same house again and again. The mother recalled nights when the girl would wake suddenly, frightened but unable to say why, only to sit the next morning at the kitchen table and sketch the house with more determination than before. The professionals interviewing her noted her composure. Most children, when questioned by uniformed officers and strangers in suits, would become shy or anxious. She, however, seemed unbothered. She answered questions simply, then returned to her crayons as if the house itself demanded to be drawn, regardless of who asked or why. The deeper question, how she knew, remained unanswered. Theories arose quickly. Some suggested she might have overheard family conversations or snippets of gossip that had imprinted on her. Others speculated about inherited memory or the possibility of old photographs hidden somewhere in her home. But her parents denied keeping anything of the sort, and no relatives could explain the connection. A more troubling theory emerged among the detectives, that the girl's dreams were not merely inventions, but impressions of something that had once happened within those walls. The psychologist pressed gently, asking her about the dreams in more detail. Did she see people inside the house? Did she ever hear voices? The girl tilted her head thoughtfully, then said she sometimes heard crying. Other times she saw shadows moving near the barred windows, though she never saw faces clearly. When she described the locked door beneath the staircase, her small hand tapped the paper exactly where investigators had forced it open days before. She added that she sometimes dreamed of scratching on the walls, though she couldn't say what was being written. By the time the session ended, the adults had more questions than answers. The girl returned home with her parents, unaware how deeply she had unsettled those who studied her. In her world, the drawings were still just drawings, and the dreams were only dreams. For the authorities, however, her unshakable certainty that she had seen the house in her sleep raised questions no procedure or manual could address. The past was being revealed through her crayons, and no one could yet explain how or why. The only undeniable truth was that the girl had become the bridge between forgotten crime and its rediscovery, and her dream seemed determined to reveal what time had tried to bury. The discovery of the house's cellar, its chains, and the scattered belongings of long-missing people left the town in a state of uneasy silence. Once investigators completed their careful work inside, the site was sealed off with tape and guards posted around the perimeter. What had once been a derelict structure, barely remembered by anyone outside of old rumor, was now treated as sacred ground. Teams of forensic specialists worked day and night, documenting every item, photographing every scratch on the walls, cataloging the evidence with a kind of reverence reserved for places where lives had been stolen. In time, human remains were carefully exhumed, each set handled with the dignity they had been denied in life. The process of identification was slow, hindered by decades of decay, but the smallest traces proved invaluable. Jewelry fragments, buttons, and even teeth bore silent testimony. Families who had carried questions for 30, even 40 years received calls from the authorities. Some of those calls brought tears of grief, others a strange, fragile relief. After decades of waiting, of hoping without reason, they finally knew. The silence surrounding their loved ones' disappearances had been broken, even if the answers carried sorrow. Funerals were arranged. Some were small, private affairs with only a handful of family left to attend. Others drew larger gatherings, with townspeople showing respect for neighbors they had not realized were victims all along. In the pews, whispers lingered about the house, the man who once lived there, and the little girl whose drawings had brought everything to light. Reporters tried to make sense of it, but the police offered only the most careful of statements. They confirmed the discovery, acknowledged the link to cold cases, and praised the diligent work of the investigative team. But they avoided mention of the girl, protecting her identity and shielding her from the storm of speculation. Within the station, however, the subject could not be avoided. Officers, detectives, and consultants who had handled the sketches admitted among themselves that the child's role could not be explained by procedure or probability. It was one thing to say she had drawn a house, but another to accept that she had drawn it with details only those who had stepped inside could have known. The barred cellar windows, the hidden door, even the scratch marks on the beams had all appeared in her drawings long before the site was ever entered. To dismiss it as coincidence felt dishonest, but to suggest anything else left them without a framework to understand. Her parents tried to bring her life back to normal. The drawing stopped soon after the house was uncovered, as if the need had vanished. She returned to school, where her teachers, aware but discreet, treated her no differently than the other children. When asked about the house later, she only said she did not dream of it anymore. The pictures, which once multiplied endlessly across pages of lined paper, ceased altogether. She drew trees, animals, and the kind of simple shapes expected of her age. It was as though she had been relieved of a task no one had given her, but which she had carried nonetheless. For the families of the victims, the closure was real but complicated. Knowing at last what had happened brought peace, but also stirred anger that the truth had been hidden so long. The man once investigated but never charged was long dead, beyond reach of justice. The townspeople wondered aloud how many had lived near the house, passed it on their way to work, and never realized what it contained. For some, the discovery changed the way they looked at their own streets, their own neighbors. As for the officers, the case was considered resolved, yet no one called it simple. They agreed quietly that while crimes had been revealed and families given answers, the mystery surrounding the child's knowledge had only deepened. How could she have known? Why had the images come to her with such persistence? There was no evidence of exposure, no indication of outside influence, no rational link that could explain it. The psychologists who spoke with her filed their reports, noting her composure and lack of deceit, but their conclusions were filled with uncertainty. They could describe what she said, but not how it was possible. Over time, the house was torn down, the ground left bare, as if removing it would help erase the memory. But the story remained in whispers told at kitchen tables and over fences about the little girl whose dreams had uncovered a buried crime. In the official record, the facts were clear. Remains identified, personal effects matched, closure achieved. In the unofficial memory of the community, however, the case was a reminder that not all answers come neatly wrapped. Some emerge through paths no one can explain, carried by children who draw what they should not know. For those who had walked through the house, who had seen with their own eyes the match between crayon and wood, the unease never left. They had solved a mystery, but in doing so they had uncovered another. The girl's drawings closed old wounds, but they also opened a quiet, lingering question that no report could resolve. In the end, the truth about the house was known. The truth about how it had been revealed remained beyond reach, leaving those who had witnessed it with the unsettling knowledge that sometimes, even when a case is closed, the mystery only grows.